Day two of the American Cup saw plenty of decisive action as four players from both the open and the women's section advanced to the next stage of the champions bracket. Hello everybody, I am International Master Kostya Kavutsky and I will be recapping all of the action here from the second day of the American Cup hosted here in St. Louis. Now first, let's get started with today's results as well as the bracket. Starting with the open section, Caruana was able to clinch his match with a draw against his second, Grigory Oparin, advancing thanks to a score of 2.5 out of 4 to the next stage. Meanwhile, Oparin is not out. He'll be relegated to the elimination bracket where he will have another chance to continue the tournament and possibly win the whole thing. Wesley So also clinched his match by winning the second classical game against Sam Shankland with the black pieces, also advancing to the next stage. And the first upset of the tournament went to Ray Robson, who actually managed to defeat Lenier Dominguez in their match, first winning the classical game and then saving the final rapid game to win their match 2.5, 1.5. And last but not least, the match between Levon Aronian and Sam Sevian went the distance to the Blitz playoff. That saw Levon Aronian winning his match 2-0 in the Blitz playoff to advance to the next stage as well. Moving on to the women's section, we had Begim Tokajunova, Alice Lee, and Nazi Pakidze all clinch their matches with a draw in that second classical game, advancing with their score of 2.5 out of 4. And Irina Krush managed to complete the comeback after losing that first game to youngster Zoe Tang. She managed to win 3 in a row to clinch her match by a score of 3-1. That means for the next matches in the champions bracket, we'll see Caruana facing off against Levon Aronian. Wesley So will take on Ray Robson. In the women's section, we'll see a big matchup between Irina Krush and Nazi Pakidze in the next round, as well as Begim against Alice Lee. So should be tons of exciting action. Of course, the other players will be in the elimination bracket. They are not out yet. They still have 1 life left. They'll be playing rapid matches. If they lose another match, then they are out of the tournament. But otherwise, they can keep going and possibly make it all the way to the championship final. So with that, let's go into the games from today. This is the second classical game in the match between Caruana and Oparin. Once again, Fabi just needed a draw to clinch this match. He opted for the Slav defense, something that he doesn't play too often, and he ends up playing this line with e6 followed by delayed c5 that he basically has played very, very rarely in his career. It's a solid line. White gets a bit of an edge, some space. This pawn advances to a5, knight comes to e5. But in general, this position was pretty solid, and Oparin wasn't able to pose a lot of problems for Caruana. h4, bishop c6 was played, and here Oparin goes for a series of exchanges. Knight takes c6, takes on d5, takes on e7, and pushes a6 here. This might have been enough for maybe a small edge for white, but it really wasn't enough to defeat Fabi, who is able to defend the position here quite accurately. And eventually the players liquidated into a very equal heavy piece endgame. Rook to b1 was played, and Fabi basically had no issues holding this from here. With that draw, Caruana was able to advance, as did Wesley So, who managed to defeat Shankland on the black side in this Queen's Gambit decline. Shankland was down a point in this match going into this game, so of course he was playing this very aggressively, looking to score the full point. And Wesley played this one quite well. Now here he plays the move queen to a6, which might be a little bit questionable, but of course his idea is very simple. He just needs a draw to advance in the match. It wouldn't clinch the match, but a draw would of course be very good for Wesley standing here, being up by a full point, and he likely thinks that he can hold the endgame. Probably white should have played something like queen to c2 to keep the queens on the board, keep things more complicated, but instead Shankland decides to allow the endgame with knight to g3, but he simply wasn't able to do a whole lot of damage to Wesley here. Eventually Wesley was actually able to overtake the initiative here after knight c5. In this position, Shankland decides to sacrifice the exchange with rook takes e7, knight takes d3, and knight c4, but Wesley found a very, very nice way out of these complications. He plays the move f5, hitting the knight on e4 and opening up the rook on f8. Bishop h6 was the continuation, rook to f7, takes, knight g5 check, king to g8, bishop takes g7 actually looks quite tricky here because the king can't take this bishop on g7 and keep the extra exchange for black, as that runs into knight e6 check. But instead, Wesley was actually able to convert the position with rook against two pieces. First, he takes on g4, plays rook to e8, and then a very nice sequence here after bishop f6, rook f8 is played, knight e4, h6 attacking this knight, and after king to c2, the very nice shot, knight takes f2. A temporary sacrifice of the knight after knight takes f2. Wesley threw in the move g3 to launch this pawn forward. The knight went to h3 in order to be able to stop the g-pawn. But now after rook takes f6, knight e4, rook f1, it was basically all over here. It's g2, g1 is coming, and white is losing another piece. In case of knight takes g3, there's rook f3 to pick up the minor as well. And with the win, Wesley was able to also clinch his match. Moving on to the match between Robson and Dominguez, this one was quite exciting yesterday as the players traded wins. Here in the classical game as white, we have a very complicated situation. Both players around 15 minutes at this point, so not a lot of time to finish off the game. I'll remind you folks, the time control for the classical portion is 90 plus 30 with no second time control. But this is where Ray really took over the game, starting with this move g4. Launching his initiative on the king side. Dominguez made a fatal mistake here with bishop to d7. It looks like such a natural move defending the bishop, but the problem for black, after the very strong move bishop to g3, which was found by Ray, white is now threatening ideas like g5 as well as f5, and black's queen on f6 is a target, but also the bishop on c7, especially after g5 takes. That bishop on c7 is hanging, the bishop on g3 opens up, the rook on f1 opens up against black's queen, and black just has major issues here. Dominguez tried his best to defend with g6, but after g5, queen h8, and now f5, a very powerful move, Ray went on to win just an absolutely brilliant game here. Bishop takes g3 was the continuation, f takes g6, taking this one first before recapturing. Black tried to keep the extra piece with bishop to d6. I think the engine was pointing out bishop h4 as a possibly better defense. But anyways, here after rook takes f7, bishop takes g5, queen to d3, white still has a huge attack, and black's position is extremely difficult. White has ideas of rook h7, possibly rook f1 first, and black's king is just very vulnerable here. So going back to the game, after bishop to d6, rook takes f7, hg5, Ray repeated once here, rook h7, rook f7, the queen had to go back, and now queen takes g5, and this was just a disaster for black. Rook takes e7 is a threat, rook h7 is actually trapping black's queen in the corner. Dominguez was forced to try queen takes h3, but now rook h7 hitting the queen, bishop h2 check, king f2. Robson just showed absolutely no fear here, relying on his calculation, realizing that his king is escaping, whereas black's king is not. After rook f8 check, king e1, queen f1 check, king to d2. This was really the final critical moment of the game where black's queen is under attack, and he doesn't have time for a move like queen f2 in view of the nice little combination, rook h8 check. Nice little rook sacrifice. After king takes, it's queen h6 followed by queen h7 mate. Instead, Dominguez had to play bishop f4 check, giving back his extra piece, but going into a completely hopeless endgame here after rook takes e7, white having a pawn up, super active rook, and Ray was able to convert this one. Now, that wasn't the end of the story. After this win, Robson was only leading his match 2-1. He still had to hold the final rapid game in this match as black, which is not easy against Dominguez, who's just long-time blitz specialist. So here in this position, Dominguez actually managed to get an extra piece out of the opening. This came from the Najdorf, but of course black had not a lot of pawns for this extra knight on d8. Rook to b8, rook e8 was played, and Ray was able to hold this one with extremely accurate play here. Dominguez definitely tried to use the extra knight, but black simply had too many pawns here. Rook b6, I just want to point out in this position, very clutch move, tying down white's knight. And after knight to d7, rook d6, knight c5, rook d2 check. The rook rips through white's position and starts picking up all of white's pawns. So pretty soon, all of the pawns were traded off, and Ray had to hold this rook and knight against rook endgame. But this one isn't that hard to hold, and Ray basically had no difficulties here. Now, the game went the full distance. Dominguez tried for the full 50 moves. In fact, they even went over the 50 moves as he was trying to win and force a blitz playoff, but ultimately it was not to be. Robson was able to hold this endgame and send Dominguez to the elimination bracket. Finally, in the match between Levon Aronian and Sam Sevian, they actually ended up drawing all 4 of their initial games. Their second classical game was drawn after a very, very long struggle in a queen and pawn endgame. Sevian was up a pawn and trying to convert for over 50 moves, basically just moving back and forth, but ultimately wasn't able to. Levon held the draw. Then in the final rapid game, Levon was a little bit better as white, and this Catalan wasn't able to do much with it. That game ended in a draw as well, and that took the players to a blitz playoff where they were set to play 2 games of 3+2 with no Armageddon, mind you, in case of a draw. In fact, the plan was to just have them play 2 games and followed by 2 more games until they had a decisive winner. But it did not last long. Levon was actually able to win both blitz games, starting with the first one here playing white. It was already a very, very complicated game. The players were down to seconds here, both under 10 seconds, where Sevian committed just a gruesome blunder, queen to c5, leaving the rook on f4 hanging. Levon, of course, snatched this one and was able to survive the resulting counterplay. Of course, being up a rook is quite a serious advantage. Then in the second game, Sevian tried to strike back with white. He definitely had his chances, but once again, this was blitz. Lots of back and forth action here, players trading the advantage. This was just the one moment I wanted to highlight. Of course, Sevian had just a few seconds on his clock here, really not a lot of time. He's actually losing this game, but in this exact moment after knight f8, Levon just gave him a beautiful chance to equalize the score, and that would have been with the move queen takes h7 check. Just an absolutely gorgeous queen sacrifice, leading to this very elegant mate into knight g6 check, followed by bishop to d5 mate. Normally, this is something Sevian would see in seconds, but of course, in a blitz game, with the clock ticking, I mean, the nerves, the stress, it is very, very hard to find this. Instead, knight to d5 was played. The game continued to just be an absolute mess, but eventually Levon was able to actually convert this one using the pawn on c2. After queen d7, knight takes f4, takes, bishop f3, bishop takes c1. Sevian had to resign here as he's now down a rook. The c-pawn is going to queen, and he just has no counterplay left in the position. Moving on to the women's section, the first match to finish was the one between Jennifer Yu and Begim Tokir-Genova. Begim just needing a draw with the black pieces in order to clinch the match, and it seemed like she held this one pretty comfortably. This came out of a Semi-Slav Moran variation. White really didn't have much of an advantage here, but here Jennifer tries e4, which is definitely the thematic break in the position. After trading on e4, takes, and knight f8, Begim was able to quickly unleash the pawn break c5 here, after which black's position is basically completely fine. The bishop on b7 opens up, the center of white is challenged, and all of black's pieces here have a very easy job. Jennifer tried for some time to push here. After knight e5, white was able to get the 2 bishops, but black's light square bishop on b7 was way too strong, and long story short, Jennifer wasn't able to pose any serious problems here, and Begim was able to eventually hold this one in the opposite color bishop endgame and clinch the match 2.5 out of 4. Also clinching the match with the draw was Nazi Paikidze, who managed to hold against Anna Zatonski. This game was quite complicated. It came out of a Catalan opening where Nazi, despite only needing a draw, is actually willing to sacrifice the c-pawn with this move e4 and play the position just a pawn down, relying on her compensation, extra space, active pieces, and so on. And I definitely think Zatonski had chances in this game here, especially after the nice move f5 in this position, striking back against white's play on the king side. Takes, bishop h6, rook to g8. The position was still very, very complicated, but I do think black had the advantage here with the extra pawn. Eventually, Nazi was able to turn things around after this sequence of moves, c3 takes, bishop takes a6, rook takes a6, and knight to c4, the knight coming to e5, and this gave white basically enough play to hold the game. After knight e3, queen takes h5. White could have grabbed the exchange here, but this would look extremely complicated after fg. Instead, white decided to take on d5, play bishop f4, remain 2 pawns down, but with tons of compensation. The c-pawn, of course, is falling, and then white has a lot of attacking chances along the files. Rook c6 was played, king g2, and eventually white was able to pick up a couple pawns back and get a lot of activity here with the rook and queen. Rook takes e6. In fact, I believe the engine was even saying that white could play for the advantage here with queen to b5, just using the activity of the pieces. But instead, bishop to e5 was played. Probably a smart, practical decision, forcing the trade of bishops. And what we ended up getting was this rook and pawn endgame, where white picks up the extra pawn that black has, and we get an equal rook and pawn endgame, which, of course, white had no issues defending. And finally, also clinching her match was Alice Lee against Tatev Abrahamian. Alice was also leading 2-0 going into today's games. She once again chose the Petrov defense, and here had to find some pretty precise calculations in order to actually hold this one. In this position, black is under a bit of pressure. Knight to g3 is coming. The knight on e4 is under attack. But Alice played the pretty bold decision to go knight takes e5 here, grabbing the pawn with the idea that if knight takes e5, queen takes e5, and f3, the knight is, of course, is pinned on the e-file, but black has bishop to c5 check. Although I think, as Alex explained after the game, this one really wasn't so clear after bishop to e3. So instead, after knight takes e5, knight takes e5, I believe her plan was to go queen takes f2 check, king to h1, and then bring the queen back, possibly f6 or f5, where the knight is hanging, as well as the threat of knight f2 check is hard to deal with. So these complications seem to be working out for black. Instead, what we saw in the game after knight takes e5 was knight to g3, queen f6, and now knight takes e5. Now queen takes f2 would not be as strong. But after queen takes e5 here, f3, bishop c5 check, bishop e3, Alice found the very precise move, queen to g5, taking advantage of the pin. Note that bishop takes e3, followed by queen g5, would actually be a pretty serious blunder after the move queen to c1, where black has unpinned. The knight is no longer hanging on e4 and hits the rook, but now white defends the rook, and the knight is still under attack. And once this knight moves, let's say knight takes g3, for example, white has the nice discovered attack, rook e8 check, followed by picking up the queen on g5, and white would be winning here. So Alice naturally avoided that, instead finds the move queen to g5, which forces a series of exchanges here after queen c1, takes on g3, takes on c1, and knight to f5. And the players reach this endgame where black actually keeps an extra pawn, but white has totally enough compensation here with the two rooks and bishop pair. Unfortunately for Tatev, though, it wasn't enough to play for a win. Eventually, the players ended up trading off all the pieces, and Alice was able to basically hold this endgame with a pawn up, where black is essentially just blockading everything and preventing white from getting in. So with the draw, Alice was able to advance as well. And that brings us to our final match, which was perhaps one of the most intriguing in the first round of them all. This is, of course, the match between Irina Krush, the two-time defending champion, against newcomer Zoe Tang, her first time playing the American Cup. Zoe, of course, won the first classical game yesterday. Irina then bounced back in the rapid game to equalize the score. And today, Irina basically started to take over, first winning the classical game and then also winning the final rapid game as well. This was their classical game, and this is where things started to go wrong for Zoe here after bishop to d3. Knight e5 was played, and surprisingly, white already has huge issues here. Knight takes f3 is a threat, and after takes, queen to e3, Irina was able to first pick up the b-pawn. And this wasn't such an easy conversion here, but it was a pretty healthy extra pawn, and Irina was basically able to slowly improve the position, rook d8, rook to d4, and eventually convert this one. Now, this wasn't the absolute smoothest, but I think white only had maybe one chance to kind of stay into the game. It really wasn't easy here. But after bishop d3, f5, takes, queen g3, g5, black was already just taking over here. Rook d3 coming, and white's pieces are just way too far away on the queen side. And actually white's king here gets into a bit of danger. h4, rook to d3, queen to d4. The king came up to f6, takes, f3, and then rook d1 was the final move in this game, with white not having a good response to the threat of queen g1 mate. So with this win, Irina was able to take a 2-1 lead in her match. Zoe had one final chance in the rapid game to equalize the score. She tried the Benko Gambit, definitely not a bad choice when you're playing for the win, but Irina was just ultimately too solid in this game. In fact, things started going wrong for black here around move 15 when Zoe played e6. And the problem with this one is that after takes, and bishop to c4, this pawn on e6, the pawn on d6, they end up being pretty serious targets here, and white is already seizing the advantage. After knight f8, Irina found a very nice pawn sacrifice e5, basically wrecking black's structure. And here white is actually down a pawn, but just completely safe. All of her pieces are in the game. Everything is super solid. Takes on f6, knight e4, just absolutely beautiful light square blockade here. And Irina was able to actually eventually win this one, although all she needed was a draw. The position was basically too good. And eventually the decisive moment comes here. After knight d6, knight e8, takes on g7, rook takes g7, queen takes e5. White's pieces are just taking over, and black's king was just way too weak. And rook d8 was the end of the game, allowing Irina to advance as well. So that concludes the second day and the first set of matches in the American Cup. Tomorrow we'll see the second stage, the semifinals in the Champions bracket, as well as the first set of matches in the elimination bracket, as the players that were knocked out of the first bracket will continue to play in the event. They're going to play a set of 4-game rapid matches. The winner of that, of course, will advance and ultimately possibly make it their way to the championship final. Folks, thanks so much for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, I'm International Master Kostya Kavitsky, signing off, and until next time, take care.